Okay, guys, so the first thing that we want to do for the Chapter 1 test, or one of the things that we want to do, is explain how science is different from other subjects. For example, like math and English. What is it about science that makes it different from some of those other subjects? Next, when scientists do work, when they do their experiments, which steps of the scientific method do they begin with? Gathering information from observations is called what in the scientific method? Gathering information from observations is called what in the scientific method? How is a hypothesis formed? How is a hypothesis formed? Be able to describe all aspects used to create a scientific hypothesis. Be able to describe all parts, aspects, steps, whatever word you want to use, that are used to create and describe a scientific hypothesis. What do scientists isolate or keep separate or leave by itself? Because that's what isolates means in a controlled experiment. What do they keep by themselves? What don't they change? What do they isolate? That's all the same thing in a controlled experiment. And a controlled experiment simply means that you're sitting there, you're isolating the variables, you're doing all the things. So don't get caught up on the word controlled. List all features, characteristics, parts of a living thing. Now, I just used several different words to describe the same thing, guys. Okay? Because again, that's the biggest thing that happens with our tests. You guys get caught up on the fact that if I said features instead of characteristics all week, you don't know what the heck to choose. Same word. Okay? Be able to look at a food web. Be able to look at a food web. Remember, a food web is different from a food chain. Food chains are linear. They go from top thing down to bottom thing. Food webs have many different organisms in them. If you're unfamiliar with it, research what a food web looks like. So looking at a food web, be able to describe which characteristic of life is represented. And we're talking about the characteristics of life in your textbook. Those are the ones you should study. Okay, focus on the characteristics of life in your textbook, not the ones in the video. Not saying that you shouldn't review any of that stuff, but focus on the ones in your textbook. Name the smallest things or objects or structures that a biologist studies. Be able to name the smallest objects, things, or structures. And again, I'm using 3 different ways to say the same word. Object can be, you can name that different ways, correct? List the characteristics that all good experiments have. Another word for characteristics might be parts. I could say steps. I could say aspects. All mean the same thing. Differentiate between a control group, variable, data, and experiment group. To differentiate means to know the difference. Okay, or even compare and contrast. What are the rules for creating a hypothesis? What are the rules for making a hypothesis? Differentiate between dependent and independent variables. Name the part of an experiment that is measured. Scratch that. Name the factor that is measured in an experiment. Okay? Name the part that is measured in an experiment. Name the thing that is measured in an experiment. 3 different ways to say the same thing, right? Choose the parts of the experiment that we don't change, that we don't manipulate, that we keep the same. Be able to determine the best graph to use if you are asked to compare items like bikes. If I ask you to compare bikes or airplanes, what type of graph would you use to do that? What is the basic unit of length? What's the basic unit of distance? What's the basic unit of volume in the metric system? Make sure you're able to convert from meters to kilo, hecto, deca, kilometer, centimeter, millimeter. Okay, so make sure you're able to convert from meter going to decimeter, centimeter, millimeter, decameter, hectometer, kilometer. Also be able to convert gram to decigram, centigram, milligram, or going up. Decagram, hectogram, kilogram. For liter, deciliter, centiliter, milliliter. Going up, decaliter, hectoliter, kiloliter. Okay, so you're either larger number to smaller number you multiply, smaller number to larger number you divide. What do you divide by? You're either going to multiply by 10, 100, or 1,000, or you're going to go, depending on what direction you're going, 0.1, 0.01, 0.001. Be able to explain why the metric system is easier than the English system. Be able to explain and choose from some answers why the metric system is easier than the English system. When during experimentation is using the metric system most important? What part during a scientific experiment is using the metric system most important? Okay, guys, so there are 21 multiple choice. There are 6 matching. The 6 matching, you are going to have to look at a sample experiment of how light affects plant growth. And then you're going to have to determine which parts represents the scientific method. Okay? So again, you're given an experiment and you are going to be looking at plant growth versus light. They'll give you choices and you choose the correct answers. Which goes back to you knowing the steps. The steps that you should study and have reviewed are the ones listed in your textbook, because other resources may add something in or leave something out, okay? There are 2 short answers. One may ask you to compare theory with hypothesis. The other might ask you to explain what bias is. Lastly, there's an essay. This essay uses mythical creatures from a popular TV show. You're going to look at these mythical creatures, looking at a little diagram, and you're going to identify the independent variable and the dependent variable. So there are a total of 30 questions on the test.